Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, in this lecture, we would be continuing with our exploration of anthropological texts that have dwelt upon folklore, and particularly with an attention to the issues of religion, rituals and rationality. Folklore have been at the base of some of the key anthropological engagements that we would look at selectively in this lecture. It ought to be pertinent to recall Robert Redfield and Milton Singer. In their own words, if we would describe the small world of a village within the universe of Indian civilization, we must at some time consider two related questions of method. Number one, can such a village be satisfactorily comprehended and conceived as a whole in itself? Number two, can understanding of one such village contribute to understanding of the greater culture and society in which the village is embedded? This was somewhere in the middle of 20th century that Robert Redfield and Milton Singer formulated these questions, which are still relevant, particularly when it comes to thinking of anthropological, sociological engagement with folklore. One wonders whether a micro context, a reading emerging from a micro context could be a good replacement for the macro context. It is this preoccupation with binaries within anthropological work that the previous lecture highlighted and discussed at length. It critically revisited the cognitive binaries which condition anthropological engagement in Western as well as non-Western contexts. This lecture will further the discussion from the previous one by delving deeper into the interface of anthropology and folklore, with a particular focus on studies of rituals, mythology, rites of the passage, festivities and celebrations. Here, we look at various dichotomies inherent in the construction of anthropological knowledge about the systems of representations and social structure of the culture under study. We would critically look at various classical texts of anthropological explorations focusing on socio-religious contents. Before we start thinking of some of the important binaries, particularly to begin with, we would be looking at the binary of us and them, we and the other, and we would try to explore as to how there is any possibility of reading certain kind of interaction between these two binaries of us and them, we and the other. Before we start on that, let us think of a French anthropologist who is very relevant for this discussion. He is a contemporary anthropologist. His name is Marc Aug, who suggested that all anthropology has been always an anthropology of the here and now. By this, he does not mean to suggest that anthropology has cast its eye only on objects that are near it, but rather that the mode by which knowledge is produced in anthropology is the mode of intimacy, and that word must be repeated several times, is the mode of intimacy. The here is the society in which the anthropologist must have travelled and lived, while the now refers to the privileged place given to the present. This mode of producing knowledge, though through experience and intimacy, had a unique intellectual object, the exotic other. This exotic other was not encountered accidentally. It was sought out as the opposite of the self, and hence anthropological knowledge came to be a map of difference, of alterity. In classical anthropology, the Trobriand islanders exemplified a society that did not acknowledge or was ignorant of paternity. The Hindus exemplified hierarchy. The Nuer exemplified the principles of segmentary opposition in fluid. The Zande showed rationality of the so-called irrational practices such as witchcraft. Reflections on the methodology of social anthropology continued to be informed by theories of the other rather than theories of the self. Not because the Western anthropologists who produced much of this knowledge within their different national traditions failed to cast an eye on their own societies, no. It was perhaps because these studies fitted into the general anthropological framework of cutting up spaces of significance within which the society and culture could be conceptualized as totalities. The investing of particular cultures with totalizing visions in which every individual is seen as representing the whole culture, as did the anthropologist Marcel Mauss way back in the first quarter of 20th century. He visualized it early on and was perhaps never more than an anthropological fantasy. Closer home in India, Veena Das showed that both these tendencies of constructing India as an anthropological object and presenting the Brahminic worldview as objective totality are present in Louis Dumoux's works, the French anthropologist Louis Dumoux's work. Dumoux tried to characterize the essential characteristic of Indian society which set it apart from Western society. Hierarchy was chosen as the appropriate object of study because it constituted an absolutely contrasting pole to what he called modern ideology of equality. Hierarchy versus equality, the binary opposite. Dumoux fell into the positivist trap when he claimed that the external view of Indian society was more objective than an internal view. And this was later on, under severe criticism, amended by Dumoux. In reality, an external view is nothing other than an interpretation of one culture through the categories of another culture. Furthermore, Dumoux's commitment to the notion of totality, to a stable reality, and with it to a stable system of representations point to the second tendency of anthropologists. In Dumoux's work, the stability of representation is achieved by privileging one worldview, that which is made up of the Brahminic concepts of tradition, and assuming that it can represent Indian society as an objective totality of the world. In positioning the Brahmin as the only voice, Dumoux was in fact participating in the creation of a master narrative of Indian society that saw Brahminic worldviews as somehow representing the whole of Indian society. Elsewhere, someone like Burghardt suggested that the anthropological knowledge about India was constructed as a function of different kinds of dialogues between anthropologists and the Brahminic tradition. Far from being a European projection, the subject people who are the objects of anthropological research enter the text of anthropologists not only as suppliers of raw data, but also as people who have actively framed the research project and its outcome. Applying this insight to an analysis of Dumoux's work, one can argue that Dumoux's Brahminic counterparts were not passive objects of scholarly perception. They enabled and framed his representation of caste. The singularity of Homo hierarchicus lies not in Dumoux's representing the Brahmin's view of Hindu society, but in his imitating the Brahmin's representation of Hindu society. Far from India being a projection of the European imagination, the Brahminic imagination manages to shape the European representation of India. This cognizance of the dialogue of anthropologist and counterpart has created an inward looking regional ethnography in which fundamental issues are being raised concerning how ethnographic texts can be written and read. It is only recently that attempts have been made to conceptualize how the ethnography of modern societies may be written without falling into the trap of an inflexible holism. We would, in the later part of this, now on in this part of the lecture, we would look at two exemplary researches which would provide instances of how attempts can be made to engage in regional ethnographies by critically looking at classical studies and entering into dialogue with the subject and her representations. And this is all underpinned by anthropologists' interest in looking at the wisdom, the knowledge, the ideas which come from the folk. Both the researches, as we would see, both the research would try to suggest, give us plenty of ideas about mourning and death rituals in different parts of the world to develop an understanding of picular rituals, death rituals, social structure and collective representations. As we know, in all societies, death has been a subject of mythology and folklore. There is no known society, historical or contemporary, that has not ritualized death, made it a subject of mythology and folklore, speculated on its origin and its finality, and tried to contain its disruptive effect on meaning in human life. In anthropological and sociological traditions, Durkheim gave special importance to picular rituals, providing the as the sources which provide the means for healing the wound inflicted upon a community by the death of its members. Someone like Malinowski characterized death as the final and supreme crisis of life and found in it an important source of religion. They both help us understand the function of death ceremonies in creating a secure world of meaning for the individual. In the ceremonies of death, the culturally valuable belief in immortality is given body and form. In the Indian case, through the rituals performed at death, the social division of caste could be better understood. Someone like Veena Das put forth an important question of locating the subject in structures of collective representations. Levi-Strauss considered it inevitable that in any ethnographic description the subject should tend to disappear. However, Veena Das sets out to approach this question by examining the category of mourners to see whether we can discern a structure within which grief and loss are articulated, such that the connections between individual grief and societal patterns of mourning may be laid bare. Someone like Hertz and Louis Dumont have concentrated upon the pollution of the mourners, impurity of the mourners, and their temporary separation from the community. On the other hand, Veena Das concentrates on the grief of the mourners and the work of mourning through which a proper sensation between the living and the dead is brought about. The community studied by Das had an anti-ritualistic orientation, as its members were followers of Arya Samaj. Therefore, the two aspects which anthropologists focus on while studying the concept of death, that is the study of non-verbal codes and the study of rules regarding purity and pollution, were found in a very abridged form in this community of Arya Samajis. This gave Das an opportunity to see other layers of social life which had not received very much attention by the anthropologists. These include the customary laments on death, which have not been studied because their semi-crystallized forms are difficult to study within a traditional anthropological framework. Anthropologists have been very successful in studying formal aspects of life when individuals can be shown to be playing roles, or when they are engaged in formal exchanges, or when people are acting out rituals whose format is collectively agreed upon. But when individual emotion seems to confuse the formal pattern, or when the context is not formally structured, the models of the anthropologist begin to falter. Das Venadas suggested that while studying grief, we may need to examine carefully the structure behind the spontaneous and often unbearable expressions of personal grief. And as Durkheim observed in his study of picular rituals, even as mourners seem to be giving themselves up completely to grief and inflicting horrible injuries upon themselves, one can discern the presence of a certain structure. For example, among the Australian Aborigines, the appropriate amount of injury to inflict upon oneself is determined more by kinship distance than by the violence of the grief. Das states that all mourning laments focused on one basic scheme, that the dead man voluntarily chose death and that this was the perfect sacrifice. The bereaved family is expected to listen in silence to the scriptures for select number of days. There is a quality of silence that marks those many days. It is a silence which is always on the verge of being broken by the violence of the grief. Building on the insights of Malinowski and Herz, Venadas stated that seeing from the perspective of the grieving individual, the ceremonies of death should help him make an emotional withdrawal from the dead person. But they must also ensure that he does not simply flee away from the scene of death and deny it completely. She draws attention to the category of mourners which have been treated as a homogeneous category by Herz. Critically looking at Herz's explanation of taboos related to mourners, Das theorizes that it is not the dead who hover between the community of living and the dead. Rather, these beliefs about the dead mirror the ambivalence of the living towards death. For it is they who hover between a fatal fascination to follow the fate of the dead man and the terrible temptation to deny this very existence, his very existence. She further stated that the rituals of mourning have to provide mediation between these two opposite poles in which life and death are seen to be completely conjoined and which are seen to be in complete disjunction. So and so forth, why we are discussing all these things. Discussing to understand that a profound issue such as death, mourning, which instantly connect an anthropologist's lens with folklore, has been central to some of these discussions. It is important because we begin to understand that there is a symbolic function which allow the work of mourning to proceed by making it possible for mediation between various poles. For instance, death is represented through symbols of excess which are articulated through the behavior of women, and in this regard one is invited to pay attention to something like loud weeping, wailing, beating of breasts and fainting that mark this behavior. Whatever the personal grief that a man or woman may feel, immobility and silence are the only languages available to men. The women are not engaged in meaningless noise, but ritualized speech. Here the binary distinction of gender is used to articulate the opposition between complete conjunction and complete disjunction of life and death. Another study which is important for our discussion in this regard is the study by Urban, which engaged in developing an understanding of picular rituals in the context of Amerindian Brazilian in Brazil. One remembers A.R. Radcliffe Brown observing in his work on Andaman Islanders that weeping was of two sorts: a spontaneous expression of sorrow, as when a child is scolded, and a ceremonial form in which men and women are required by custom to embrace one another and weep. He argued that the purpose of the latter form was to affirm the existence of a social bond between two or more persons. Through this research, Urban reopened the question of whether and how such ritual wailing accomplished this communication function and by extension how ceremonially expressive forms were more generally articulate through a complex semiotic pathway. The empirical focus is on Amerindian Brazilian. Through an analysis of the ritual wailing form as a sign of vehicle, Urban tried to show that wailing functions simultaneously on two planes. The plane of overt expression of emotion, in this case feeling of sadness at separation or death, and secondly the plane of covert expression of desire for sociability. Urban stated that grouped together under the term ritual wailing, or as it is called Koro ritual in the Amerindian Brazilian ethnographic literature, are a number of vocal styles in many respects diverse, but sharing in common certain resemblances to what we naively label crying. These semblances are of two analytically distinct sorts. Firstly and formally, the styles typically share at least some sound shape features with crying. Secondly and functionally, Amerindian Brazilian ritual wailing occurs in contexts that include those associated with sadness, that is, death, departure, and the separation. These resemblances reveal a core set of form function linkages, but one that washes out as we move away from the center on either the formal or functional plane. It is in this regard to the limits of this outward radiation that Amerindian Brazil, especially south the Amazon basin, is of particular interest. Urban pointed out that it is here that we encounter a rich spectrum of formal devices and functional contexts for the ritual wailing complex. It was noteworthy that in this regard it is so called welcome of tears. Welcome of tears was first remarked by the 16th century Europeans who visited the Tupi Namba. In the welcome of tears, the wailing device is actually used to greet visitors whom one has not seen for some time, or even to greet total strangers. This is of interest because another form, the ceremonial dialogue, is used in northern and western South America for the same purpose. Urban conjectured that we thus have in greetings an area where two radically distinct vocal styles are used at the same functional locus. From here, let us move on to the dichotomy of whole and part. This is another very interesting kind of binary opposition, the whole and the part, the universal and the particular. It's been such an important dichotomy, such an important cognitive binary categories that in several ways almost every theorist would try to formulate something along this line, such as Emile Durkheim would say that the whole is not equal to sum total of parts, so and so forth. The passage that we referred to in the beginning of this lecture presented a similar notion of totality and stable reality through the binary of whole and part. Robert Redfield and his approach to peasant culture is another instance of a similar notion. According to him, the culture of a peasant society is not autonomous, but an aspect or dimension of civilization of which it is a part. As a peasant society is a half society, so peasant culture is a half culture. It is fully comprehensible only in relation to the civilization in which it is contained. In order to grasp the compound nature of peasant culture, Redfield employs two important concepts: the great tradition and the little tradition. A discussion on this happened in some of the previous lectures too. In any civilization, there is a great tradition of the reflective few and a little tradition of the largely unreflective many. The societal dimensions of these two traditions are the great community and little community. Thus, the great tradition is the culture of the great community of priests, theologians and literary men who may not even have seen the village. Those two traditions are not mutually exclusive, but interdependent. Two currents of thought and action, distinguishable yet overflowing into and out of each other. Redfield's reaction is against the traditional anthropological assumption fostered by the anthropologist's experience in primitive societies, that culture and social structure are coterminous, incarcerated, so to speak, within the physical bounds of the particular group studied. Redfield suggested that peasant society and culture are in an empirical sense open, and that it is necessary to give this openness conceptual formulation. And this kind of openness he tried to see in various manifestation, empirical concrete manifestation of folklore. Looking at that openness vis-a-vis folklore, he offered more vigor, Redfield offered more vigor to his categories, binary categories of little tradition and great tradition, and thereby underlined the possible interactions between these binaries. Another study which illustrates this binary of whole and part is Malcolm Marriott's study of a village named Kishangarhi. Once again, it was alluded to in previous lecture too. Marriott, somewhat in the middle of 20th century, built his case by stating how M. N. Srinivas found that he could not interpret the rituals and beliefs of Coorg villagers without tracing the same rituals and beliefs to literary levels in the much larger units of the region and nation. Malcolm Marriott quotes various studies which according to him suggest that Indian little community is not a world in itself. He suggested that the concept of primary civilization is best suited to describe the relations of the village and its universe. A primary civilization is a carrying forward of cultural material, norms and values that were already contained in the local little traditions. If the great tradition absorbed foreign material, it subjected them to a process amounting to some sort of syncretism. An indigenous great tradition remains in constant communication with its own little traditions through sacred literature, a class of literati, a sacred geography and the rites and ceremonies associated with each of these. Malcolm Marriott sets out to extend the concept of primary civilization by examining its implications for one little community, namely Kishangarhi. He studied the religion of Kishangarhi village through its festivals and by looking at various deities. Marriott stated that the religion of the village may be conceived as resulting from the continuous process of communication between a little and local tradition and greater traditions which have their places partly inside and partly outside the village. And he further emphasized that since both great and little traditions exist within the religion of little communities such as Kishangarhi, study of religion of a little community can contribute to understanding of processes of universalization and parochialization. Universalization being an upward spread of cultural phenomenon and parochialization being a downward spread of cultural item, phenomenon, practice. While both Redfield and McMarriott have demonstrated the connections that exist between the culture of a peasant society and the larger civilization in which it is contained, the concepts they employ need critical re-evaluation and clarification. Dumont and Pocock reflected upon it too, that Redfield assumed that any peasant culture is a composite structure consisting of a great and little tradition, whereas it is doubtful whether the great tradition is in fact institutionalized in that manner in which we see little community. Methodologically, Louis Dumont and David Pocock further pointed out that it is desirable to approach peasant culture as a single tradition, a little tradition, contrasted with a doctrinal and philosophical great tradition. Viewed in this light, the so-called misinterpretations given to the ideas and activities derived from the great tradition have some purpose. They have been recast and reformulated and brought into line with the peasant world view. They are misinterpretations or crudities if viewed from the perspective of the great tradition. If viewed from the peasant's perspective, they may be a part of a single meaningful tradition. Peasant culture, in other words, is not a half culture as Redfield says it is. The average person's identifications occur within a single tradition and his roles are meaningful mostly in relation to his tradition. It is, however, possible that there may exist in a village a religious intellectual who may have rejected the village tradition, and such a person properly is no peasant. There are also almost inevitably some who have rejected part of the tradition of the masses as undesirable or unworthy. These again have done so by virtue of intellectual contact with the higher thought of the region. Such cases, by no means exceptional, are important, for they illustrate the constant ideological intercourse between the two traditions, an intercourse often leading to cultural change. The notion of a great tradition is not new, but it has been held by scholars for some time, and Redfield too admitted its posterity. Its diffusion to social science, however, was largely due to Robert Redfield. Many social scientists studying peasant societies in South Asia have explicitly or implicitly held the notion of a great tradition, its manifestation on the village level, and its syncretism with a little tradition of popular belief. Through some of the points, Gananath Obesekere explained why Redfield himself may have decried the usage of these binary opposites, because its usage has led to several pitfalls and misconceptions. The first point is that it has encouraged the equation of peasant beliefs derived from a great tradition with the great tradition itself. Gananath Obesekere cited many researches to prove this point. For example, citing Ryan's study, Obesekere stated that Singhali's village, in the study of Singhali's village, Ryan entitled one part of discussion as From Buddhism to the Wonderful World, and another part was entitled as The Wonderful World, Gods and Demons. The former one, the first one, the wonderful world, the From Buddhism to the Wonderful World, reflected a great tradition, and the latter the latter one reflected folk supernaturalism or animism. One recalls Kaufman in similar study of Thai community. Kaufman spoke of Buddhist rituals alongside Brahmin Buddhist rituals and predominantly Brahmin animistic rituals. In Kaufman's study, confusion has been multiplied, for according to him, there is manifested in the village not one great tradition, but two Brahmanism and Hinayana Buddhism. The notion of a great and little tradition has led to the structuralization of the religious system of a given village in terms of levels, layers or strata. The image being that of horizontal layers, one on top of other. Animism, our third level of beliefs, underlies both Brahmin and Buddhist practices and is for the former indistinguishable from the latter two. Buddhism and Brahmanism have become so closely interwoven as to be indistinguishable to the ordinary Thai worshipper. If these layers are indeed indistinguishable to the Thai worshipper, the anthropologist surely does violence to the data by conceptualizing them as layers. Thirdly, the third kind of pitfalls of these binary opposites of the whole and the part, the universal and particular, the micro and macro, is that the image of cultural layers has led to, in turn, to the notion of a supernatural or animistic residue. The bogey of animism has long haunted missionaries and intellectuals interested in peasant communities in South Asia. To most people, the practices and beliefs of the village seemed flagrantly to violate the ideologies of the great tradition of any place. Although subscribing nominally to a great tradition, these people were animists. Rarely was the term animism clearly defined. It became a convenient label under which one could subsume beliefs or customs one did not fully comprehend or was impatient with. The more sophisticated studies of Burmese Buddhism from a behavioral angle could not dispense with this loosely defined but convenient term. The social scientists, wedded to the image of cultural layers, have perpetuated the animistic myth, the residue of beliefs and rituals which could not be subsumed under a single great tradition, or traditions were conveniently lumped together as animism or supernaturalism. The Thai peasant practices in the Hinayana form of Buddhism, which through the centuries has become so blended with Brahmanism and with elements of an earlier animism that it is impossible to segregate pure elements of each. If it is impossible to segregate pure elements, why attempt to do so? Let us move on to another set of binaries, that is the binary of thought and behavior, and how this binary has appeared in the representations, anthropological representations, and how this binary was taken from the field based material. And this binary would eventually lead us to see some kind of preference between the seeing and hearing, the visual and the voice. Toward the end, we will get to that, toward the end of this lecture. There has been a marked insistence of anthropologists that empirical fieldwork tradition is necessary for a proper understanding of Indian society. For instance, M.N. Srinivas emphasized that the book view of Indian society is only a sectional view of social reality that vitiated actual observation of social behavior. This shift from the approach considered typical of Indologists, an approach which was also called armchair approach, The shift from that approach to the approach considered typical of social anthropologists has certainly helped to build up knowledge about the functioning of social institutions based upon first-hand information acquired in the field through what is famously known as participant observation. From another point of view, however, the central place accorded to observation in anthropological research and the development of a positivist approach has had certain undesirable consequences, as it has been accompanied by a studied refusal to discuss the epistemological issues about the basis of knowledge and the nature of truth. What is considered to be the objective existing reality described in anthropological literature has already passed through the filters of prior perceptions, since the anthropologist has antecedent ideas about the relevance of the diversities of the facts that he encounters in the field. The relative neglect of these problems has led to the conception of the external world in anthropological writings as a pre-existing model. Progress in the knowledge has been related to the development of conceptual apparatus, which is similar to reality in that it is considered capable of imitating the properties and relations of the external world. While anthropologists have been right in rejecting the philosophical position that knowledge can be derived from consciousness, the conception of social reality has invested it with a kind of concreteness that it cannot really possess. One of the consequences of defining social reality in terms of concreteness has been that the emphasis in anthropological research has shifted from the study of ideas to observe behavior. For example, in the field of religion, ritual behavior was studied, but not religious thought. In the village studies, which accumulated in the 1950s, one finds description about ownership of land, about exchange of foods and services, but no information about the structure of ideas, about Brahmanhood or untouchability. An important departure is also found in the writings of Louis Dumont, who not only reject the dichotomy between thought and behavior, but also insists that an explanatory model cannot be limited to a replication of observed reality. This is why he tried to reduce observed diversities of thought and behavior to which the actors may not themselves be aware, but which lie behind manifest diversities. Thus, one important difference between the structural method which Dumont applies to Indian society and the earlier methods is in their conceptualization of the relation between knowledge and social reality. Whether one agrees with the substantive part of Dumont's writings or not, the altered conception of the nature of anthropological explanation itself constitutes a landmark in Indian sociology. His method is important because it may help place emphasis on studying how people organize their material world. It marks the shift towards the direction in which anthropologists are concerned with delineating the principles of classification used by the people themselves. Thereby, it becomes imperative to discover an answer to the basic epistemological issue, namely that of relation between knowledge and reality and in anthropological models. Some anthropologists state that social anthropology in India should be limited to the multiplex relations to be found in the tribes of India. To limit the scope of anthropology in this manner, however, amounts to treating a literate civilization as a non-literate society. The reaction against the Indologists' endeavor to derive all knowledge of India from the study of Sanskrit texts led to a redefinition of certain subjects of study such as Hinduism. M.N. Srinivas's distinction between Sanskritic and non-Sanskritic Hinduism stressed on the fact that Hinduism also existed outside the Sanskritic texts and that the religion of the peasant was an integral part of Hinduism, and that gave a sufficient ground for understanding as to how folk Hinduism also is a possibility. However, in posing this kind of binary, M.N. Srinivas did not see that there was a possibility that both Sanskritic and non-Sanskritic Hinduism worked with common structural categories, so that religion of illiterate peasant might constitute a structural transformation of the religion of the sophisticated literati. Louis Dumont argued that one must give due emphasis to the study of Indological material in order to discover the constants of the Indian civilization. This was a famous ground on which a lot of suggestions came about the fusion of sociology, anthropology and Indology early on in the intellectual history of sociology and anthropology in India. And there has been a lot of criticism as well of this kind of reliance on Indological material. However, one also accepts the fact that the indigenous sources of knowledge ought to be brought to the center of discussion in sociology and anthropology, so as it could have contextual sensitization. Dumont, like his predecessors Marcel Mauss from the French school and Ghurier, G.S. Ghurier, Kapadia, Iravati Karve among the Indian sociologists, has used Indological material in piecemeal fashion, allegedly. It is suggested that one studies Sanskrit and other classical texts in a monographic fieldwork instead of using them merely for the purposes of illustration. This approach would make it possible to analyze the structure of a text in its entirety. Veena Das attempted an anthropological study of Hinduism, and we read about that in her book Structure and Cognition, Structure and Cognition, Aspects of Hindu Caste and Ritual. In her analysis of Dharmaranya Purana, Veena Das found that it was not possible to discuss kingship only in relation to Brahmanhood or renunciation only in relation to the man in the world, as Dumont had done elsewhere. It is the interrelationship of all these categories which defines the universe of discourse, and selecting pairs of binary relations one at a time amounts to misstatement of the problem. Veena Das illustrated that the empirical categories of Brahmin, Vanika, king and sannyasi have been used as conceptual tools in the text to express the structural order of Hinduism. From this whole discussion in this lecture, we find very interesting kind of possibility which makes us optimistic about a more thorough and cutting edge relation between anthropology and folklore, anthropological engagement with folklore, which could give us some kind of marker of moving ahead from where we have reached in our engagement. Various kind of binary oppositions which are very integral to 20th century conceptualization of society based on folklore played important role. They were inherent in the construction of anthropological knowledge too. Throughout the essay, throughout this lecture, each part of the lecture explored certain kind of binaries and tried to show as to how those binaries are playing instrumental role in the formulation, anthropological formulation. these binaries have also appeared largely in the methodological framework. They have also been used as questions of method. They stem from the conception of the culture under the study as the exotic other with different modes of knowledge and products of imagination, varying ways of understanding and representing the world, such as folklore, rituals, mythologies, rites of the passage, festivals and celebrations. While the Eurocentric nature of anthropology has long been recognized, what is unique about anthropology as a discipline is its use of the other to overcome the limits of its origin and location. This, however, does not cancel out the significance of the problem with Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism being the source of knowledge, the context being somewhere in Europe and then offering universal generalizable principles. If the traditional anthropological vocation may be described as that of cultural criticism, as did someone like Clifford, its method of arriving at this position through a study of other cultures has been a scaffold for the construction of anthropological knowledge. One must ask then what this process of making a society available to anthropological gaze does to its self. As we have discussed, the cognizance of the dialogue of anthropologists and their counterpart has created an inward looking regional ethnography in which fundamental issues are raised concerning how ethnographic texts can be written and read. There have been several attempts to conceptualize how ethnography of modern societies may be written without falling into the trap of an inflexible holism. There is this relatively recent idea of using voice to describe the relation of an anthropologist to her subjects, and this has attracted a lot of potential pursuance. This kind of discussion on the importance of voice and associated verbs such as hearing and listening helps us overcome the reifying notion of gaze or seeing, the visuals, because it is in that domain of gaze or seeing the visuals actually we do all kind of unrecognizable interpretative politics, whereby we attribute meanings to objects as anthropologists without taking cognizance of that. Yet, so long as we continue to think of the inner world of subjects as an inward space of representations, this space can only be disclosed only if in a mirror, an inner life objectified under a gaze. In order to cast off this reifying anthropological gaze, reifying because this anthropological gaze is never subject to any kind of questioning. In order to cast off this reifying anthropological gaze, critiques of vision show it necessary to be supplanted by a voice, which is expected to be more open to the fragmented and multiple character of social experience. The anthropologist must appear not in the role of the observer, but that of a hearer, a listener, a conversationist, and the subject must correspondingly appear in the role of a speaker. By this means, the subject of study for anthropology, with their host large corpus of knowledge, folklore, they are all transformed from third person to first person. Her relation being mediated now through the voice with the second person. Veena Das cited the example of how Bhopal gas tragedy victims have been transformed in professional discourses into irresponsible litigants and frauds, and how that cautions that the very rules which frame voice in modern professional discourses may silence those who have become victims on account of the mysterious functioning of world. In this lecture, we have tried understanding various kinds of binaries which are very crucial as cognitive devices in understanding social reality, and how those binaries sit in the center of anthropological engagement with folklore, and thereby they generate a good host of understanding about social reality. We have also understood the limits with those binaries, in spite of the fact that they helped us in 20th century in making an analytical understanding, in arriving at an analytical understanding of society. However, we have understood that the in full sum, if you want to exhaust the potentials, hermeneutic interpretative potentials of folklore, probably there is need to go beyond those binaries. In this lecture, so long, this much. Thank you.